I used to think that after 60, life wouldn't bring any more big surprises, that the only shocks would come from doctors, the invitations would be for grandchildren's birthdays, and affection would belong to the past. But just when I got comfortable with that idea, the unlikely happened. I fell in love with a man older than me, an 80-year-old widower, and despite the age and the wrinkles between us, I had never felt as young as I did by his side. If you enjoy real stories filled with emotion, late-in-life love, and the courage to live what once felt impossible, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Every week, you'll hear a story that might just feel a lot like your own. Like mine once was. Like mine still is. My name is Margaret. I'm 62 years old. I'm a retired teacher and have lived alone since my divorce almost 10 years ago. My daughter lives in another state, and we don't talk much. My daily companions are the plants in my backyard and the little arrangements I make in reused glass jars. Life was calm, predictable. But that weekend, everything changed. And it changed with a simple gesture, a long handshake. His name was Harold. He had curious eyes, slow words, and a presence that filled the emptiness of the room where we met. I knew nothing about him. I didn't even want to. It was just a talk on urban gardening at a community center. But the moment he sat in the chair next to mine, the world around us started to fade into silence. This isn't an easy love, and it's not a young one either. But maybe it's the truest I've ever known. Because it came when no one expected anything anymore. When time seemed too short. When everything already had its place. And even so, it arrived. And stayed. It was a Saturday morning when I went to the neighborhood cultural center. Not because I had any deep interest in vertical gardens, but because my mind was full of quiet thoughts, and I needed to get out. The talk was about plants in small spaces and how to turn trash into creative pots. I got there early, sat in the second row, opened my bag, and took out a notebook. Not out of habit, but out of politeness. That's when he sat beside me, tall, thin, wearing a neatly pressed light blue shirt and a white handkerchief in his chest pocket. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "Do you often come to events like this?" I laughed. So did he. And as silly as it may sound, that was the beginning of everything. We exchanged comments during the talk, and afterward, we left together for a juice. Harold had been widowed for 5 years. He had 3 adult children, all distant. He spoke of his wife with affection. I didn't ask too many questions. It felt right to respect his space. He also told me he used to run restaurants all over the city, but nowadays he lived more slowly, tending to his garden and going to events like that one. There was something about him that held my attention. Maybe the calm tone of his voice. Maybe the way he listened. We said goodbye with a long handshake. And when I got home, something in me felt different. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't desire. It was just a quiet sense that I had met someone who, for some reason, shook my certainty. I spent the rest of the day tending to my plants, trying to name what didn't yet have a name. That night, before falling asleep, I caught myself smiling. And that hadn't happened in a long time. I thought maybe it was just kindness, just a good conversation. But deep down, very deep down, I knew this was going to lead somewhere. And even if it didn't, it had already been enough to remind me that I was still alive. 3 days later, I saw him again. By chance, or luck, or fate, if that sort of thing exists. I was at the neighborhood flower shop picking out rosemary seedlings when I heard that same calm voice asking the clerk about lavender seeds. I turned around, and there he was, Harold. With the same gentle smile and a gaze that seemed to linger a little longer this time. We talked right there, between flowers and bags of soil. He invited me for a coffee at the corner bakery, and I said yes. We sat outside in the morning sun. He ordered a latte. I had hibiscus tea. The conversation flowed as if we'd known each other for years. We talked about old movies, simple meals, noisy neighbors, and even about loneliness, though we laughed about it more than anything else. There was a kind of peace next to him, a feeling that time moved slower, without pressure or demands. I found myself sharing things I usually keep to myself, memories of my childhood in the countryside, my difficult divorce, the lessons I loved to teach, and the times I thought about moving to a small town. And he listened so carefully, as if every word I said was something precious. At the end of our conversation, he said, "I'd love for you to see my garden. It's not big, but it has soul." I smiled, and without thinking twice, I said yes. We set a day for the following Sunday. When we said goodbye, Harold held my hand gently. And in that simple, sincere gesture, something inside me opened again. I walked home with a fresh bouquet in my hands and a soft restlessness in my chest. The good kind, the kind that pushes us beyond our invisible walls. I didn't know where this was going, but for the first time in many years, that didn't matter. What mattered was that I wanted to see where it would go. Sunday came with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Harold lived on a tree-lined street, the kind that still holds silence between houses. The front door was slightly open when I arrived. He appeared in the hallway wearing a dirt-stained apron and a sincere smile. "Sorry for the mess," he said. "I was having a conversation with my orchids." I laughed, and in that moment, I strangely felt at home. The garden was, in fact, small, but every corner seemed to hold a story. Old pots, rescued plants, pieces of wood turned into stands for bromeliads. He showed me everything with a quiet but contagious enthusiasm. In every plant, a detail. In every detail, a memory. It felt like he had rebuilt his entire life within that green space. We sat on the porch and drank fresh lemonade. We talked about the weather, the trees, and things people don't say much anymore. Harold told me his wife had loved that house, but she never had much patience for plants. He laughed about it tenderly, without bitterness. I listened with care, sensing that there was still a living grief there, but also a longing for new beginnings. At one point, we fell silent, and it was a good silence, one of those where the air feels heavier and the world pauses for a moment. He looked at me but didn't say anything, just smiled, and I felt the urge to take his hand. I didn't, not yet, but the thought stayed with me. On the way home, I walked slowly. I looked at other people's windows, ivy-covered walls, dogs at the gates. Everything seemed more beautiful, lighter, more present. And I knew what was beginning between us was small, but real. And for me, that already felt enormous. I arrived at Harold's house in the middle of the afternoon, carrying a lemon cake wrapped in a floral dish towel. He greeted me with the same gardening apron and kind eyes. He was excited. He said he had prepared a simple lunch and wanted to show me his collection of old photos. The table was set in the garden, under the shade of a trumpet tree, with 2 seats and flowers picked from his yard. The food was light but full of flavor: roasted chicken with herbs, golden potatoes, and a salad made with leaves picked right there. We talked about 60s music, Doris Day films, and how certain memories hide in scents. I felt good, so good that I forgot to check the time. We were beginning to experience an unhurried intimacy, built on quiet details and shared moments. Then we heard the doorbell. Harold looked surprised. When he opened the door, I saw 2 men and a woman in their early 40s. "My children," he said, trying to sound casual. They entered with firm steps and sharp eyes. They greeted me with the kind of formality you use when shaking hands with a stranger. I smiled politely, but the air between us turned colder than the shade of the tree. During coffee, they asked questions disguised as conversation. Where I lived, what I did, how long I had known their father. The daughter, especially, kept her eyes fixed on my every move. I could feel they were trying, under a polite veneer, to figure out my intentions. Harold noticed. He tried to ease the tension with a silly joke about orchids, but no one laughed. After they left, he let out a deep sigh. I apologized for causing any discomfort, but he held my hand and said, "It wasn't you. It's just their fear. Fear of me getting hurt. Fear of losing what they think they still control." I nodded, but deep down I knew that afternoon had changed something, and not every garden has room for new flowers. On the way home, I felt a weight on my shoulders. Not anger, not sadness. Something more subtle, the ache of being seen as a threat when all I wanted was to build something tender. Reality had started to seep into the enchantment. But even so, I didn't regret a thing. The days that followed felt strange. Harold kept calling, sending me pictures of his plants, trying to keep things light. But something in his voice had changed. A hesitation, as if he were waiting for me to be the first to walk away. I understood. His children hadn't said everything out loud, but their gestures, their absence, had made the message clear. I wasn't welcome in that circle. Even so, we met at a downtown bookstore. He picked out a book of vintage recipes. I grabbed a photo album filled with wildflowers. We had coffee right there, and he told me his children wanted to have a serious talk about our relationship. He said it with embarrassment, as if loving someone at 80 was somehow foolish. I asked him what he felt. He said, "I just feel like living, that's all." And it broke me, because it was so simple, so honest, so pure, and yet so hard to accept for those who believe old age should be only waiting and caution. Harold wanted to live, and for some reason that made no sense to anyone but us. He wanted to live with me. Still, he seemed torn, and so was I. I didn't want to be the cause of a rift between him and his children. I didn't want to become one of those women who erase themselves just to keep the peace. But I also didn't want to intrude on a space that might never be mine. I kept going home with a heart in conflict, watering my plants with the same care I tried to give that unfolding story. What really hurt wasn't his children's rejection. It was the fear that he himself might give in to their pressure. Because sometimes even the most beautiful love can't survive guilt. And Harold carried so much of it. So much. Guilt for smiling again, for holding another hand, for finding peace after his wife had passed. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask for anything. I just stayed, present, attentive, available for whatever was possible. Because despite everything, I felt, in every part of my body, that this man still had so much love left to give. That afternoon, we went for a walk in a park he loved. The leaves were starting to turn yellow, autumn gently revealing itself in a way only mature eyes know how to see. We walked slowly, side by side, in no rush to get anywhere. Harold told me childhood stories about a dog he had when he was 10, and the time he ran away just to see the ocean for the first time. I listened to every word like someone listening to an old song. There was sweetness in the way he remembered, a memory without urgency, one that embraced everything, joy and sorrow alike. We stopped on a wooden bench. He offered me a piece of chocolate from his pocket. We laughed at how simple it all was, and in that moment, everything felt perfect. Everything felt whole. That's when he kissed me. No warning, no formal permission. He just pressed his lips to mine with the same gentleness he used when watering his plants. And I kissed him back, because my body wanted to, because my heart wanted to, because life wanted to. It was a quiet kiss, warm, full of silence on the inside. And when it ended, he simply said, "Thank you for being here." I stayed there with teary eyes, trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't euphoria. It wasn't confusion. It was just a slowly growing fear. Fear that this moment might be too brief. Because when you've lived a lot, you know that the things that feel too good often scare us the most. We walked home holding hands, and for the first time, he called me my dear. 3 simple words, but to me, they echoed like promises. I knew harder days would come, but right then, what we had was love, and that was enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the sky through the window, and I thought that if this love were a potted plant, it would still be fragile. But it was planted, with tiny roots, and too much hope to fit in just one chest. In the days that followed, Harold tried to keep our calm rhythm, but it was clear that something was weighing on him. He called less, avoided making plans. One day, as we had lunch in my backyard, he put down his fork and said, "They think I'm confused, that you're distracting me from grieving." I stayed quiet. He continued, "They want me to go to therapy and to stay away from you, at least for a while." My heart tightened. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him and asked, "And what do you want, Harold?" He looked away, picked up a leaf from the table, turned it in his fingers, and answered softly, "I want peace, and you give me that." But I knew peace wasn't enough to keep love alive under that kind of pressure, especially when you have children who confuse care with control. I told him my daughter also tends to treat me like I'm made of glass, always worried about what people will say, about appearances, about the supposed shame of being happy after a certain age. "They're afraid of us really living," I said, "because it reminds them that their time will pass too." He gave a sad smile, nodded silently. The tension started piling up between us, not for lack of affection, but from too many fears. He began canceling our plans, said he needed time to think, to sort out his thoughts. I understood, but it hurt, like it always hurts when you realize you might not be enough to fight off someone else's ghosts. I threw myself back into gardening, gathered new jars, painted some pots, made arrangements to give away. I tried to keep my mind busy, not my heart. But at night, when the silence laid down beside me, his absence felt like a cold shadow over my chest. I missed him. Even the way he fiddled with his napkin. The only thing I was sure of was that I wouldn't insist. I wanted to be a choice, not a burden. And if Harold chose to walk away, I would let him go. It would hurt, of course, but I'd still be grateful for reminding me, even if just for a little while, that my heart was still alive. The phone didn't ring for almost a week. No messages, no explanations, just silence. And even though I knew it was part of his process, the absence started to sting like a wound that doesn't bleed, but still burns. I went to bed earlier, pretended I wasn't waiting, but I was. Every night, I waited. I started to wonder if it had all been a mistake, if the kiss, the coffees, the walks had only been moments of illusion for someone who hadn't yet processed his grief. I found myself questioning whether maybe I had given too much to a story that was never fully mine. Doubt is a poison that drips slowly, but it contaminates everything it touches. My daughter called. We talked about small things. She didn't ask about Harold, and I didn't bring him up. I didn't want to seem fragile. I didn't want to hear her say, "I told you so." I pretended to be fine. I talked about the plants, the new arrangement I donated to the neighborhood library. She said I sounded cheerful. I gave a weak laugh. She didn't know I was smiling with my face and crying with my chest. On the fourth night, with no word, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs. The sky was clear, full of tiny stars. I remembered the day Harold told me about the first time he saw the ocean. He said he cried, without even knowing why. In that moment, I understood. Because beauty sometimes hurts, especially when you feel like it won't last. I thought about calling, sending a short message, but I didn't. If love has to be chased, it's already broken. And I promised myself, years ago, that I would never again beg to be wanted by someone who hesitated. I had erased myself too many times before. Now, I just wanted to remain whole, even if empty. That night, I fell asleep with my eyes open, my body lying down, but my soul sitting by the door, waiting. And deep down, way down, a foolish hope still held on. The kind that survives even when everything seems lost. It was Friday. I was at the old school where I taught for over 20 years. I'd gone back to drop off a floral arrangement for the receptionist, who was retiring. I came in through the side door, like I used to. The smell of paper, the hallway sounds. Everything brought back memories of a life that felt like it belonged to another time. I felt good there. But something was off. Then I heard my name. I turned, and there he was, Harold, standing there with a bouquet of lavender in his hands. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just looked at me, and smiled as if seeing me for the first time. I walked toward him slowly. My heart was pounding like I was 30 again. "You came all the way here?" I asked. "I didn't know where else to find you without crossing a line," he said. He apologized, said he needed to go quiet in order to face his fears, that his children had pressured him, even threatened to challenge his autonomy legally, that he felt confused, tired, ashamed, but that he never stopped thinking about me. It was in the silence I realized. "Missing you hurt more than fearing them," he said, his eyes full of tears. I didn't cry, even though everything inside me was trembling. I just smiled and accepted the bouquet. We talked for a while behind the school building, like two teenagers sneaking around. We laughed about it. We talked about missing each other, about fear, about wanting to keep going, despite everything. And there, surrounded by lavender and memories, we made the simplest and bravest decision: to begin again. Not like before, not trying to please anyone, but as two adults who had chosen not to waste the time they still had. No rush, no pressure, no promises, just presence, just truth. That night, he dropped me off with a kiss on the forehead, and for the first time in days, I went to bed expecting nothing, because what I wanted was already there. It was his idea. A weekend in a cabin in the mountains, far from everything. No cell signal, no clocks, no kids around. "Just the two of us and time," Harold said, with a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in a while. I said yes. Packed a small bag, brought 2 jackets, and an old cookbook I bought on impulse. It was the first trip I'd taken with someone in many years. The cabin was simple, cozy, surrounded by pine trees and silence. It had a wooden porch with 2 rocking chairs and a fireplace that Harold insisted on lighting, even with the warm weather. We made dinner together: vegetable soup, fresh bread, and red wine. Then we ate in our socks, sitting on the floor, listening to music from decades ago. He made me dance. I laughed, clumsy, but I laughed with joy. We slept wrapped in each other's arms. No rush, no guilt. His body was warm, real, full of marks and stories. I felt like a woman again, whole, not invisible, not forgotten, just alive. The next morning, we had breakfast watching the fog lift from between the trees. And in that quiet space, free of demands, I knew it was possible to start a new life, even after 60. We spoke little about our families. We agreed not to let the outside world in. It was our refuge. And for those 2 days, it truly was. We walked hand in hand, had a picnic on the grass. He picked flowers for me. At night, he read aloud from a memoir. His low voice filled the room like a warm breeze. On the last day before leaving, we sat on the porch in silence for a long time. Then Harold said, "If this were the last weekend of my life, I'd be at peace." I squeezed his hand, and I promised, without saying a word, that I would keep that place inside me forever. The trip ended, but what was born there didn't. We came home with a different look in our eyes, the look of people who know exactly what they want. And even if the world didn't know how to accept it, we did. This love was here to stay. On the way back to the city, reality was waiting for us, like a half-open door letting in cold air. Harold's children didn't reach out for days. When they finally did, it came with subtle accusations. "They found out we traveled together," he said, eyes down. "They're saying I was irresponsible." I stayed quiet. I'd expected it. The freedom of an older person always seems to bother those still living inside the rules. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, far from his neighborhood. He looked worried, said his eldest son had threatened to cut him out of some financial decisions if he kept seeing me. "They think you've bewitched me," he joked, trying to soften it. But there was pain in his eyes, pain from being treated like he was incapable, like a senile old man caught up in a fling. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said, "I want to live, but I don't want to fight either." I understood. And once again, sadness paid me a visit, because loving someone who still needs their children's approval is like loving with the brakes on, and I've never been good at holding back my heart. Still, I held steady. I took care of my plants, my routines, my body. I didn't want to lose myself while waiting for him to find himself. He kept coming, calling, holding me gently. But there was a line I couldn't cross, an invisible barrier between us, made of guilt, fear, and convention. Sometimes I saw him arrive with his shoulders more hunched than usual, as if life had gotten too heavy. On those days, I just offered tea and silence. Because there are moments when love doesn't need to say anything. It just needs to stay, steady, like roots in good soil. I still believed in the strength of what we had, but I began to realize that maybe it wasn't enough. And that realization, mature as it was, hurt like a thorn hiding in a flower. My daughter came to visit on a Sunday. She gave little notice, as usual. Brought an apple pie, asked about the plants, complimented my hair. But the moment I even gently mentioned Harold, the atmosphere shifted. She looked at me with a mix of pity and judgment. "Mom, he's 80 years old. Don't you see this isn't going to work out?" I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, tried to explain that I wasn't looking for a future, but for presence. That Harold wasn't a fantasy or a patch. He was an encounter, and maybe that's exactly why it mattered so much. She shook her head. "You should think more about yourself," she said, "instead of getting involved with someone who's already tired." Her words cut deeper than they should have. She didn't stay long. And after she left, I found myself alone, sitting at the table with the untouched pie in front of me. I thought about everything I had done for her, how many times I gave up living just to avoid causing trouble. And now, even free, I still had to ask for permission to love. That made me angry, but mostly it broke my heart. Harold called that night, said he thought about me all the time, that the physical absence of his children was one thing, but their constant disapproval was a burden. And I understood. As a woman, I understood. Because my daughter and I were living different reflections of the same fear, the fear of being judged for loving outside the rules. That night, I dreamed of a house full of doors, and me trying to open each one with keys that didn't fit. I woke up sweating, with a knot in my chest. I went out to the backyard, still dark, and sat on the damp ground near the succulents. I needed to touch the earth, to feel something solid beneath me. I wanted to hold on, but I didn't know for how long. Because loving alone is like watering a flower pot that's no longer on the windowsill. The gesture remains, but the plant isn't there anymore. It was on a cloudy afternoon that I got the news. Harold had fallen down the stairs at home and was in the hospital. I rushed there, heart pounding. When I arrived, the reception was cold and bureaucratic. I gave my name, said I was close to him. The woman typed something, then said in a neutral tone, "Access is restricted to family only." It felt like being pulled out of a space I didn't even know wasn't mine. I tried to argue, to explain that he was expecting me, that he wanted me there. But the answer didn't change. The children requested privacy. I stood there, frozen for a moment, like the world had suddenly shrunk. I sat down in a corner of the waiting area and waited. I called his phone. It was off. I called again, and again. Nothing. Everything in me was begging to see him, to hold his hand, to say, "I'm here." 2 hours later, I saw his daughter coming out of the elevator. She walked briskly, purse slung over her shoulder. She saw me, stopped, didn't smile, didn't wave. She came over calmly and said, "My father is fine. It was just a scare, but he needs rest now." "And me?" I asked. "You're not family," she replied. It hurt. Not just the words, but the tone, as if my love didn't count, as if my care was just a distraction. I walked home with heavy steps. The house felt emptier than ever. The cup he always used was still in the dish rack. The book he read in the cabin was still on the table. I touched the cover, and my eyes burned. I sat on the floor in the living room, as if I could get closer to myself there. And I cried. Not out of desperation, but out of injustice. For being pushed out of a love that was just as much mine as it was his. I stayed up all night. Every sound from the street felt like an echo of loneliness. In the morning, I made tea and sat in the backyard. I looked at the plants and thought, I deserved more, not from Harold, but from life. I deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, and above all, to be respected. This wasn't a fling, it was love. And if that made people uncomfortable, that wasn't my problem. From that day on, I decided I would no longer ask for permission to exist. And if Harold still wanted me by his side, he would have to defend me. Because love can be quiet, but it can't be cowardly. 3 days later, Harold called me. His voice was weak, but steady. He apologized, said he wished he had seen me, that he tried to talk to his children but was stopped. "They think they're protecting me," he murmured. I stayed silent for a few seconds, torn between resentment and tenderness. I chose tenderness, but with limits. I said, "You need to decide, Harold. Either you live by your own will or by theirs." He didn't answer right away, and I understood. It wasn't easy. A man raised to obey his family doesn't immediately grasp the cost of freedom. But I knew, if I backed down again, I'd lose myself. And after so many years rebuilding my dignity, I wasn't going back to being a shadow. I told everything to an old friend, someone who had seen me through my darkest days. She listened carefully, poured me a coffee and said, "You still love with your whole body. That's rare. Don't let them break you into pieces again." It made me think. Loving after 60 is an act of courage, because the world no longer expects anything from us. And precisely because of that, it expects us to settle for crumbs. That night, I made a different kind of floral arrangement. I used bigger jars, long-lasting flowers, and I left it at the hospital door with a note that simply said, "To remember what endures." It was my way of saying, I'm still here, but I won't be invisible. If you want me, show it. If not, let me go for good. Love is not begging, it's choosing on both sides. The next day, he showed up at my gate, pale, with a small scar on his forehead and tired eyes. "Will you let me in?" he asked. I opened the door, but I didn't hug him. I waited, and he said, "They don't control me anymore." Then he cried. He cried the way only men who've spent their whole lives being strong know how to cry. And I finally cried with him, not because of pain, but because of relief, because in that moment I knew he was choosing to love, even afraid, even against everything, but by his own will. A few days later, Harold told me he wanted to gather his children. "I want them to hear you. I want them to see with their own eyes what we have." I admit I was afraid, but I agreed, because part of loving someone is showing up whole, without apologizing for existing. We set the date for a Sunday, a big table, a bright room, and 3 hard stares waiting for me. I started by talking about myself, about my life, my years teaching, the loneliness after my divorce, the simple life I led. I looked each of them in the eye and said, "I didn't come to take anyone's place. I'm just sitting beside someone who chose to love me." The daughter crossed her arms. One son sighed. The other just watched me closely. Silence, but a different kind of silence. Not one of disdain, one of listening. Harold spoke next. He told them about our trip, the coffees, the love he felt. Said he knew who he was, what he wanted, and that he was no longer a man lost in grief. "I found life in her," he said, and those words, spoken by an 80-year-old man, had a weight that even old wounds couldn't ignore. The daughter stood and went to the kitchen. The eldest son asked, "Are you sure about this, Dad?" And Harold replied, "For the first time in a long time." I didn't say anything else. I just sat tall, hands folded in my lap. Because sometimes, presence is the strongest argument. Before they left, one of them looked at me and said, "If this is what makes him feel good, then we'll try to accept it." It wasn't a blessing, but it was enough. A crack, a step, and sometimes in life, that's all we need to keep going. That evening, Harold walked me home holding my hand, and as he closed the gate behind us, he said, "From now on, it's you and me, with everything that means." And for the first time, I believed him completely. That week felt different. For the first time, Harold and I walked together without fear of being watched. We went to the neighborhood grocery store, sat at our usual bakery, passed by the book club he used to attend. He made a point of walking beside me, not ahead, not behind, beside me, as if saying with every step that he was with me, and that was that. On Friday, he surprised me, said he wanted to take me to a Retirees Association event. "There'll be live music and dinner," he said casually. I hesitated. I still feared disapproving looks, but he insisted. "I need to introduce you to my world." And there was something in his voice that didn't ask. It declared. So I put on my best dress, fixed my hair, and went. We arrived holding hands. There were about 50 people in the hall, most of them gray-haired and smiling. Many knew him and were surprised to see me there. But Harold didn't flinch. He made a point of introducing me to every group, looking them in the eye and saying, "This is Margaret, my partner." Partner. A word that, coming from him, felt like recognition, like a shield, like roots planted deep in the ground. During dinner, we danced slowly to an old bolero. I could feel eyes on us, but none of them bothered me, because his hand on my waist was steady, and the smile on his face was calm. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not tolerated, not merely accepted, seen. And in that moment, everything made sense. At the end of the night, he went up to the small stage and took the microphone. He said a few words, spoke of time, of grief, of the right to begin again. And then, in a soft voice, he ended with, "I've chosen to spend whatever time I have left next to someone who brings me peace. And that's all I need." Some people clapped, others just smiled. But I cried, quietly, as if my body was finally resting. We drove home in silence, our fingers intertwined. And when we stopped at my gate, he looked at me with tenderness and said, "Now you're part of everything." And I believed him, because it was true. I was no longer a shadow. I was home. Today marks 5 years since that kiss in the park. Harold is still by my side. We've grown older, of course. Our legs ache more. We get tired faster. But the love, it's softer now, deeper, lighter. Life with him isn't made of grand surprises. It's made of shared tea, of silences that don't feel heavy, of hands that still reach for each other even in sleep. Our backyard has become a little paradise. Together, we've built a garden with recycled pots, flowers that survive the winter, and wooden benches where we sit at dusk. His children visit now and then. They bring cakes, speak respectfully. So does my daughter. We still have our differences, but now there's a quiet understanding. They realized I didn't ruin anything. I simply cared for what was still alive. I don't regret anything. Loving at 62 taught me things I never knew at 30. It taught me that time isn't an obstacle. It's an invitation. That the body can be a refuge at any age. That love, when real, doesn't need to be defended all the time. It holds itself up with small gestures and constant presence. We're not a couple that draws attention. We walk slowly. We speak softly. But if someone looks closely, they might notice that there's something between us that time hasn't touched. Something planted late, but with so much care, it bloomed even stronger. And if I could go back in time, I'd choose it all over again. The fear, the silence, the conflict. Because through them, I found what I had searched for my whole life. Someone who looked at me gently, who accepted me fully, and stayed. Love came late, but it came in time.